Putin just 2 days ago he talked about these neo-Nazis in Ukraine, that he wants to investigate the crimes they were committing in these regions, these ethnic Russian regions.
Именно так работают сейчас органы предварительного следствия в новых регионах нашей страны, в Новороссии и Донбассе. Способствуют их интеграции в единое правовое пространство России, защищают конституционный порядок и законность. Необходимо продолжать системную работу по расследованию преступлений карателей, иностранных наемников и неонацистов.
How these neo-Nazis got so powerful in Ukraine? It was before 2014 coup or after the coup?
It was after the coup. They're pretty much a World War II phenomenon. They were Nazi collaborators coming out of World War II that were locked up but then released in the Soviet Union, and some of them got exported to the US and Canada, where they were cultivated. And then when the Ukraine gained its independence, they were inserted back in. And they were a very minor force until the 2014 coup, at which point the Americans pretty much put them in power. You know, the right sector and all those people basically rushed into Kiev and took over. And then they perpetrated atrocities in the Donbass and in Odessa. They didn't manage to do anything in Crimea. That all happened too quickly. But basically, ever since then, they've been perpetuating a terrorist war against the civilian population, both in the Donbass and in Russia itself. You know, trying to attack Moscow with drones, that sort of thing. They're criminals. And what Putin said is basically a reminder. It's not new information, but basically. Criminal cases have been compiled on all of them throughout this period of time. There's an entire library of them. Eventually, if they're still alive, they'll be rounded up, put on trial, and locked up. There's a moratorium on the death sentence in Russia, but it may be lifted just for the sake of hanging all of them, which was done with their brethren immediately after World War II. That's what was done with Nazi collaborators from Eastern Europe, from Eastern Ukraine, Western Ukraine. After World War II. That may happen again, but this is not really news. This is just a reminder.
You know that we have a Russian group in Ukraine. One of the most prominent one is this guy called Denis Kapustin, who made this group called Russian Volunteer Corps. They're fighting on the part of Ukrainian. They're helping Ukrainian to fight Russia. What's their ideology?
Well, first of all, you know, Russia is a big country with 150 million people. And the fact that there may be 20 or 30 complete, stark raving imbeciles from that number is not really surprising. It's not surprising that the Ukrainians found them and cultivated them. It is somewhat surprising that they can't fight after all that, which they've shown. Their little incursion into Russia ended in a complete fiasco. A lot of them got killed. A lot of equipment got lost, and they retreated in shame. I don't think that they're going to add up to anything.
One of the reasons for this special military operation in Ukraine was the NATO expansion. And Putin, since 2007 in Munich conference, was warning the West that this NATO expansion is problematic for us. But they didn't pay much attention to what he was talking about.
Well, they basically thought that Russia is a has-been of a country, that it has no future, that its opinion is irrelevant. And on the other hand, NATO has to expand because its bureaucracy gets hungry otherwise. They basically have built an entire industry in in absorbing more and more countries. To what end? It doesn't really matter. No end at all, I think. It is also not really effective as a defensive pact. It is not effective in any way at all, actually. Imagine what would happen if Russia were to decide that, for instance, Estonia is no longer a country because it has forfeited its sovereignty for neglecting the rights of its very large Russian-speaking minority, and therefore by international law it is no longer a sovereign nation, and just roll in there and establish their own rules. Well, who is going to start World War III over Estonia? Who wants to die in a nuclear war over Estonia? Who wants to go to war with Russia over Estonia? No sane person in the world. Since Americans already said that a war directly with Russia is out of the question, the only thing that's keeping this from happening is that Russia doesn't really care so far, but it might in the future. Who knows what will happen? So as a defensive pact, NATO is useless. It is just a giant bloated bureaucracy that doesn't really serve any purpose whatsoever except to enrich a bunch of bureaucrats and a bunch of weapons manufacturers.
The Biden administration argues that this this war in Ukraine made NATO even stronger. Now we have Finland and Sweden joining NATO. It says that this is a gain for NATO. This is a win for NATO. How do you see this?
Well, it's definitely not a win for Finland. Sweden is not part of NATO yet because of burning of the Quran and other such issues, and giving refuge to terrorists. But Finland was basically created by Russia. It was a Swedish colony until then. But it was the Russian Empire that basically provided the environment for Finland to develop into what eventually became a sovereign nation, except now they've surrendered this sovereignty to Washington. But the Finns, I guess, are a little too slow to realize that the only time life is good for them is when they are doing lots of good trade with Russia. When they can, first of all, they love going to St. Petersburg and getting drunk. It's a quick trip across the border. They kept driving across the border to fill their gas tanks because gas is 4 times cheaper on the Russian side. They got all of their firewood from Russia. So now what are they going to heat their saunas with? I don't know. And basically the country is now clearly circling the drain just because they cut their ties to Russia. Some of it is just remarkably stupid. They had a high-speed train, the Allegra train, that circulated between Helsinki and St. Petersburg. I rode it. It was a wonderful train. What did the Finns do with it? They cut it up for scrap. Brand new high-speed trains cut up for scrap just to please the Americans. So basically, NATO expansion has to do with countries losing their sovereignty, becoming failed states, and then getting absorbed into NATO. So how is NATO getting stronger by absorbing weak nations that are made weaker as a result? I don't see how that's possible.
You know that this is a country that survived the Cold War without having any problem. But now they suddenly decided to join NATO. Nobody understands what they're thinking of.
Oh, I can understand what's going on. Basically, they're run by idiots. The Americans have this entire production line of idiots to put in charge of countries. It's not just the Ukraine that got this I don't know what for a president. If you look at Maya Sandu, who is in charge just to the south of there, or if you look at the people in charge of the Baltics and of Finland now, they're basically obedient puppets that have been pre-programmed by the Americans, by various organizations, such as the Soros people, all of that. And they are not at all interested in the countries they run. Moldova is of no interest to Maya Sandu. She's not even from there. You know, that's not even her country. It's not her language. She's from the neighboring Romania. And she's just installed there as a kind of a remote controlled device. She serves foreign interests, and she's not the least bit concerned about the lives of the people. You know, same thing with the Finns, same thing with the Estonians, and you can almost tell these people by the completely vacant expressions on their faces. They're like robots. They're like puppets, like brainwashed puppets. It's very sad, but these countries are no longer run by their own people. They're run by aliens.
You know that last week Putin was warning Poles not to interfere in Ukraine. He says that he knows that Poles have some desires for Belarus. What's behind this argument?
Well, the history is very, very long and kind of boring, but basically, Poland is a country that regularly self-destructs. In fact, if you look back on European history, what you should generally do if you want your country to survive and not get partitioned or just completely eliminated from the political map is the opposite of what Poland does. Basically, look at what Poland does and do the exact opposite and you'll be fine. So now the Poles, for some reason, think that they have an opening to connive some money out of Germany, to grab a big chunk of Western Ukraine, to maybe grab a big chunk of Belarus. They have all sorts of all sorts of dreams of regaining territory that was peopled by a sort of Polish diaspora, because Poland didn't really exist as a country for long durations of time. And during that time, the Polish population sort of diffused through the surrounding areas. And now they have this strange dream of fashioning an empire out of all those areas. And the thing is that the few times in history when Poland was strong and united, it was horribly run, absolutely horribly, incredibly corrupt and self-destructive, and eventually it failed, not because of any external conflict, but because of internal failure. So Poland is one of those countries that has to be carefully watched and saved from itself to whatever extent is possible. And that's what both Russia and the United States, surprisingly, are trying to do now. They're trying to talk the Poles down. What is hopeful at this point in time is that although the people in charge in Warsaw are as crazy as most Polish nationalists have ever been, the Polish people aren't really interested in going out and getting slaughtered. Maybe they actually learned their history a little better than their officials, than their government.
And just 2 days ago, Putin said that they have to be thankful for what Stalin gave them. that chunk of territory that that Stalin gave them. And when we look at this, the Poland map before and after the Second World War, we see the difference. This is a big chunk of territory that they gained. What did Stalin give them that chunk of territory?
Well, it was land that was peopled by both Poles and Germans. And after World War II, the Germans, as the defeated nation, were asked to go. They were asked to leave. Very impolitely, I might say. They were basically thrown out. And the territory was given to Poland for no adequately explored reason. As it turned out, both East Germany and Poland were, they ended up in the Soviet camp. And so a stronger East Germany would have been actually helpful to the Soviet Union, much more than a stronger Poland ever could be. So that was a very questionable decision. I think part of it was a question of punishing the Germans for starting the war and for Nazism. But as Stalin himself had said, German leaders come and go, but the German people remain. So for the sake of the people, it might have been smarter not to give that land to Poland ever, at all.
In that region, we have Ukraine, we have Poland, and we have these neo-Nazis in Ukraine. By pouring all these weapons, are we going to have something like what we have in Iraq, in Afghanistan, when the US left Iraq, they left a lot of weapons in the hand of those terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, in Afghanistan as well. But do you think after ending this war, do you think that it's gonna make something like what we're seeing in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, first of all, both Iraq and Afghanistan become rather peaceful as soon as the Americans pull out. Secondly, those terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, are products of U.S. intelligence, or lack thereof, rather. They were funneled weapons. They were given support. They were organized. Al-Qaeda is very much a brand that was created in Hollywood, down to the last details. The orange jumpsuits were a nice touch for the people they beheaded. But basically, these are all created conflicts, and as soon as this foreign interference ends, all of these problems become soluble. The weapons are not really a problem, because if there isn't enough of a reason to fire them, they just remain in stockpiles. Nobody goes out and gets shot for no apparent reason. And all of these things are going to be resolved once America is finally out of there.
Do you think the same case, you believe that the same case is applicable for Ukraine?
No, I think there are enough people in the Ukraine whose only choice is lifetime prison in Russia or death.
Biden administration claims that we are stronger right now, but they have enough ammunition to send to Ukraine. And they finally decided to send these cluster bombs to Ukraine. The Biden administration said that they are verifying that these weapons are being used in an acceptable manner. And we see that they use it against journalists. Recently, just they killed the Sputnik journalist. How do you think that these acts by the Ukrainian government is in coordination with the CIA and MI6, or they're doing on their own?
I don't think it really matters whether the CIA or the MI6 inspires them to commit terrorism or empowers them to commit terrorism or forces them to commit terrorism. They're behind them. We know that. And the Russians know where their enemies are. If you ask the average Russian person on the street who the real enemy is, enemy number one is the US, enemy number two is Great Britain. The Ukraine is not the enemy. The Ukraine is just in the way. It's just cannon fodder. They're slaves being driven to die, at the hands of Russians.
When we look at what Zelensky did after getting elected, he ran on a promise to make peace talks with Russia. But right after he was elected, he went into a different direction. He simply forgot whatever he promised to the Ukrainians before the election. How do you see the Zelensky's role in the whole situation? Is he responsible for what's going on in Ukraine? His administration is responsible, or they are just puppet of the US?
He's just a puppet, but he's a rather unruly puppet because he's not really, he didn't start out being a puppet. He started out being a comedian, except he stopped being funny. His native language is Russian. He's basically Russian. Okay? His family, they're basically Russian Jews. And he was quite funny when he was a comedian in Russian. The moment he started speaking Ukrainian, which he speaks rather badly, he stopped being funny. In fact, at this point, he's rather tedious and decidedly unfunny. But what happened to him is he did get elected because he loves the limelight. He likes to schmooze and to be sort of a man of the people. So he got elected by actually convincing people that he's going to change things for the better, based on his performance in a comedy show where he played the president of the Ukraine, hilariously, and the Ukrainians, having no better choice, voted for him. Well, really quite ridiculous. But anyway, after he got elected, he got a tour of the front lines of the Donbass and got to meet some Ukrainian nationalists who basically showed him that, well, here we are shelling Russian civilians because that's what we do. And that's what we'll keep doing no matter what you tell us to do. And what's more, we're getting our weapons from the Americans and they're not going to stop. And you're just in the way. And his reaction was really hilarious. It was on camera. He asked, am I a chump? Am I a fool? He said it in Russian, "Я что, лох?" And that was, I think, his epiphany, his turning moment. That's when he realized that either he goes along with this plan of committing war crimes, or he himself and his family are going to die at the hands of these nationalists. Then they'll just appoint somebody else. He'll be a casualty or a hero, and they'll just appoint some other president. And since then, he's been basically doing drugs to keep himself sort of sane, I guess, and going along with this plan of killing Russians who are trying to. So it's really, he's a sad character. He doesn't really rise to the level of being evil. He's just a comic who's lost his way.
Because you know that Zelensky just announced on Wall Street that more than $400,000 billion in public assets are for sale. It's just to remember, it's more than twice Ukraine's entire GDP. They made it's a website. It's privatization.gov.ua. that they put all the items on this website. How what they're doing to Ukraine and Ukrainians?
Dismantling it and depopulating it. Basically, the people who think that they own the Ukraine at this point have no use for the people, and they have no use for the country. They've lost control. The country has lost control of just about everything. It no longer has any industry. It no longer has much infrastructure left, and what infrastructure it does have is old because it was inherited from the Soviet Union and never updated. They've sold off their farmland, which is their most important asset, to Monsanto and Cargill and various other companies. They made deals with BlackRock, basically giving BlackRock control of all of these other assets. And so basically the Ukrainian people, what's left of them, are in the way. And they're going to be impolitely asked to kind of move along because it's no longer their country. That's what's happening. And Zelensky is just doing whatever he has to because the people who, I wouldn't say behind him, but the people telling him what to do, basically they want their money. They want their money and they want to get out. And this has been the case with the Ukraine ever since independence. There has been absolutely no solidarity. There's no question that there couldn't be any ethnic solidarity because there's no Ukrainian ethnicities to speak of. You know, it's a hodgepodge of various types of Russian. But basically, all they ever wanted to do was steal as much money as they could and buy a mansion in Miami Beach, which is what Zelensky managed to do. So he's a success by Ukrainian standards. And that's what they're doing. They're dismantling the country. Now, they may get a surprise because all of these assets that they are quote unquote privatizing may not end up in a jurisdiction that would ever recognize their property rights, and that might be a minor snag for them. So they might lose the money and lose the property, but that's what they get for playing a game like that.
You know that it seems that Europeans are getting tired of this war in Ukraine. They want to get out of it, but it doesn't seem that Biden administration gonna let them to do that. How do you see these relations between Europeans and the Biden administration?
Well, how many days does the Biden administration have left? I mean, he's about to get impeached, and I don't think there's much of a question of him running for a second term, which means that he's a lame duck president. And if he's a lame duck president, then what he says doesn't really matter that much. Now, the person who will probably replace him is Donald Trump, who said that he will end the war in the Ukraine in 24 hours, he said?
Yeah.
He said that it would take a couple of phone calls for him to end it. He also said that NATO should be disbanded. He also, I think, said that the EU is kind of useless. So I think looking at what Biden administration or the blob that's, as some people calling it, that stands behind him, you know, some parts of the Democratic Party and the deep state and various federal departments, I don't think it really matters what they want. What they're going to get is going to be very different from what they want.
The failure that they're experiencing in the Biden administration I don't know if you saw that Kissinger went to China to solve the situation between United States and China.
It's not really a negotiation. It's sort of a farewell tour. I think that Kissinger got support for going to China was because the Americans knew that he would be honored. And the reason that the Americans knew that the Chinese would honor him is because he's in Chinese eyes, an honorable person. He's someone who is, for the Chinese, tinged with nostalgia. He represents what the United States once was, back when it was run by competent people like Kissinger, like Nixon, people who you could actually make deals with, people who controlled what came out of their mouths, who were, to some extent, men of their word. So that was not so much to negotiate, but to preserve some appearance of having, a reasonable posture, a reasonable, modicum of respect, because, Blinken went in there and he was pretty much just kind of slapped around, told to smell the flowers and get out. Various other Western dignitaries went there and got even worse treatment. Ursula von der Leyen is a glutton for punishment. She goes to Turkey and gets to sit on a little footstool, whereas the men get to sit on armchairs. She goes to China and she has to go through passport control and get her diplomatic passport stamped. She doesn't even get the VIP treatment. She's an extreme example, but all of these other people, they're basically not even safe to send to a place like China or Russia, because they'll just be laughed at. Whereas Kissinger, he's the real thing. He's a mastodon of world politics. He represents the world that once was, back when the United States was a powerful country, as opposed to whatever it is now.
Wall Street Journal reported that the West knew that this counteroffensive in Ukraine wasn't gonna end well for Ukrainian, nor for the West. But they decided to do that. Why, in your opinion, if they knew that, why they went along with that plan?
Well, they still had some weapons to use up, so that they could order new ones, because the American military-industrial complex needed to make the money to give kickbacks to the American politicians so they could run for re-election. It's election year next year. I think that was part of the reason. The other is to pretty much go on with the project of emptying the Ukraine of people by having them go out and get slaughtered. They're down to enlisting old men and cripples at this point and sending them to the front without any air support, without any artillery support. And now the new fashionable thing, since the Russians are so good at destroying Western armor with their drones, without even any tanks or armored personnel carriers, just basically march forward with some small arms and some mortars and try to dig in and have the Russians destroy you or take you captive. It doesn't matter. It's just basically the whole country is getting utilized.
It seems that Biden wants to continue this war up until the election, Because if this war ends before the election, it seems a disaster for Democratic Party. Do you think that they would be able to continue this war to the next year?
They might try, and well, you see, on the one hand, the Russians are not in any hurry at all. The Russians are basically honing their armaments. They have this wonderful new program developing drones that work together, that have artificial intelligence. They're all up on artificial intelligence. And the fact that they get to practice them on a battlefield is very nice for the Russians. They don't want to miss out on that opportunity. They're not suffering that many casualties. They don't really have to struggle to maintain their numbers at all, because first of all, their casualty rate is low. Their battlefield casualties survive, and a lot of them return to active duty. And secondly, there are a lot of volunteers, because in Russia now, serving in the army is seen as not only honorable, but also lucrative, and something you can do for your family, because the people who go and serve get all kinds of wonderful perks. And yes, they risk their lives, but then after that, if they survive, then their lives in many ways turn for the better. In fact, I know some people whose lives were not very good, so they went into the army, and now they're pretty happy about it. So the Russians could very easily stretch it out for their own internal reasons. They have a strategy where they have this impenetrable line of defense, in fact, 3 lines of defense. They're ramping up their weapons production. They're improving their weapons. They're proving their mettle as the purveyors of national security worldwide, so that they're basically working on developing a partnership with China, where China takes care of consumer goods, industrial production, things like that, and Russia takes care of issues of national security. All of Africa almost is in St. Petersburg right now on a Russia-Africa summit, and a lot of them are signing deals having to do with defense and national security, because Russia is seen as affordable and efficient in providing national security services.
And we have reports from Wall Street Journal that says that the sanctions didn't work, and Russia is selling the oil above the price cap. And how did Russia overcome those difficulties?
Well, the world really has no choice. There's a shortage of oil in the world that's going to get increasingly worse, because the shale oil bonanza in the United States has run its course. It is on a plateau now, but it's going to go down, down, down. So basically, the entire shale oil episode, which produced something like 6 or 7 million barrels a day for the past decade or so, that's going to end. And then there's no substitute for those millions of barrels a day. In fact, even before it's over, the U.S. has completely, almost, significantly rather, drained its national petroleum reserve. And this is a reserve that is for emergencies. So what's the emergency now? The emergency is that the world is running out of oil. Now, is Russia running out of oil? No, not really. Russia has enough oil for itself for many generations. and still has some oil to export, though probably not as much moving forward. And so the price of oil is going to go up, even as consumption of oil is going down. The U.S. is in a particularly bad shape as far as that, because it's producing 13 million barrels of oil a day, but it's consuming even more. It actually can't provide for its own needs. So even while the shale oil is gushing, it still has to import oil from around the world, especially heavy oil, and especially from Russia. Because Russia and Venezuela are the only two choices. The Americans have completely failed in Venezuela. So it makes sense that no matter what anyone wants, Russia will get its money for its oil. It's inevitable. What's happening now is that Russia is not getting paid in dollars or euros, so the oil business is becoming rather opaque. Also, it's hard to tell where the oil is coming from or going, because Russia has invested its money in something like 400 or 500 used oil tankers that are now basically a kind of gray fleet that is not under anyone's control. It's not insured by the usual Western insurance companies. And so it's hard to track. And so the West is really losing, not just losing control of the oil, but losing track of it.
You see, as you mentioned, we see the real loser in this game is Europe, because they lost this pipeline that it goes from Russia to Germany, and they buying oil and gas at a higher price. I mean, and we can understand the mindset of Europeans, why they want to end this war, why they want to get out of this war, because they're sending money, they're sending weapons to Ukraine, they're losing cheap energy that comes from Russia to the European states, and where they can get this oil, if it not comes from Russia, they can get it from Turkey, India. It still is Russian oil. It doesn't matter, because but it would be more expensive. Do you think that it plays a role in the mindset of Europeans?
I don't think that the Europeans have much control over their destiny at this point. Look at what happened. The Americans blew up their pipelines and they just took it. They sat there and did nothing and said nothing. A few public protests that amounted to pretty much nothing. Now, oil and gas are very different. Oil is, the same. You can ship it across the world, refine it, ship the refined products again across the world. That's what's happening now. Russian oil goes all the way to India, gets refined into gasoline and diesel. That gets shipped to Europe, or a lot of that also gets shipped to the United States. So that's fine. Russia doesn't really have the refinery capacity. Who loses on that? Well, the Europeans do, because their refineries stand empty, and they're paying more for gasoline and for diesel. Natural gas is a completely different story, because there the difference between pipeline gas and liquefied natural gas is huge. Liquefied natural gas is significantly less efficient, because the equipment is expensive, and because of all the losses in liquefying gas and then regasifying it. As a result of that, it's basically a third of the energy that you get out of the ground that gets delivered to the end user. Two-thirds. So a third of it just gets lost in refrigeration and various other costs. And so when Germany had the pipeline running, that gave it a huge advantage as an industrial nation and allowed it to position itself as the industrial powerhouse of Europe. Now it has lost that advantage, and its industries, especially the chemical industries that are the most gas dependent, are being idled, shutting down, going bankrupt. And they have not found a source to replace the gas that they've lost. There's a huge missing chunk of natural gas that they have not been able to replace, that they used to get directly from Russia, but they no longer can. And the other thing is that Europe is a lot less efficient in their use of liquefied natural gas than Asia. So the Asian countries can always outbid them for liquefied natural gas, and they can do it on a day-to-day basis. It depends on weather fluctuations and other things. So basically, the Europeans are waiting for a confluence of events, basically an uptick in activity in Asia and higher demand for liquefied natural gas combined with a cold winter. And suddenly they're looking at burst pipes all over the place because they can't heat all of the properties that they have.
If you see, the car production in Europe is a big chunk of their economy, and it when you compare to 2021 to 2022, it increased by 10%, but from 2022 to 2023 they have a drastic reduction in the car production, something like 36%. That's huge for their economy, as it's devastating.
Yes, the largest car producer in the world now is China. And that happened very, very quickly. And Chinese cars went from sort of very hard to maintain because everything changed from one model year to the next to now being relatively solid. And now something like the majority of cars sold in Russia are Chinese. And the Chinese cars have suddenly become relatively respectable.
We know that Macron wanted to participate in this BRICS meeting, but just 2 days ago they announced that they are not going to invite Macron to this meeting. Why he was interested to participate? What was his goal, in your opinion?
Well, I think as a former banker, he just smelled money. You know, if you look at the Chinese characters for BRICS, it's actually the character for gold, the character for brick, and the two characters that mean countries. That gets lost in translation. It's not just BRICS, it's gold BRICS. So basically, this is a club of countries that are going to trade in their own currencies and settle any trade deficits that develop by an exchange of gold that they will hold basically to themselves, that will not be tradable. It will just be used to settle trade imbalances. So Macron definitely wanted to get in on that action, but was told, sorry, it's members only. And you are a member of the opposite team.